at this point for me, I'm just kind of done with these notions of ultimate truth. And to be honest, I don't care if this mystical map is the ultimate truth. I'm concerned with how it affects my life. I'm concerned with how it affects my relationships and how it affects other people and society. And so I think the thing with trying on or exploring different maps is to see what experience it leads to.
Hello, everyone. That was the voice of today's guest, Jessica Nathanson. After spending many years engrossed in the spiritual philosophy of non-dualism, Jessica grew disillusioned with some of its more dehumanizing tenets. She now runs a blog called The Glorious Both And, where she collaboratively reflects upon spirituality going wrong and what a more humane and wholesome approach might look like. One quick note. You will hear Jessica and I using terms like non-duality, Advaita, and even neo-Advaita throughout this talk. If you're not familiar with them, they are all really just variations on the word spirituality. I do want to reflect on how my use of these terms might not be helpful, but that's one for the future. Right now, here's Jessica explaining her journey.
Yeah, the first thing that strikes me, and I think that it's something that I try to communicate, is that Neo Advaita was radically liberating for me. I mean, that was my holy grail. Like for, it was probably about 4 years that it was nothing. Like I was an evangelist, if you will. But well, I mostly kept it to myself, but I would have been. But it was radically liberating. So I think that the message that I really want to get out and share is more so the double-edged sword aspect of it, and how something that can really radically free people can also later on, or maybe quickly on, can something that can be radically freeing can also be radically imprisoning, and that it's that both and I think that the whole sort of like panacea advertisement of it is what's so part of what's so problematic about it, because everything it says to do and that will alleviate suffering is also something that can be a source of suffering. And so there's just all of these really difficult things there where, the no self, no suffering is, I would say, not a trustworthy or reliable description of a path that's going to be in the long term contributing to overall well-being. That's my perspective from what I've seen and what I've experienced.
From listening to interviews you've done, I think maybe we have a similar experience here, that a lot of the concepts which spirituality really values, like no self, they kind of depend on the context in which you get into them. So, like as a teenager, I read Rene Descartes. So when we first got the internet, that's one of the first things I did. I downloaded Descartes' Meditations. What a weird thing to do when you're
Yeah.
15,
Oh,
but
wow.
that's what I did. And in that philosophy, which is kind of like a self-inquiry, right? Descartes goes in to find this solid sense of I think, therefore I am self. And that felt like, okay,
Yeah.
that sounds great. So I exist, and then I can go figure out what life is with this solid sense of self to stand on. And then when I was around 18, that just started falling apart in ways like I realized I go to sleep at night, right? And
Yeah.
this I that I think I am just completely disappears for 8 hours. And like, how did that never occur to me? And then if I didn't sleep enough, I'd be kind of groggy the next day and I wouldn't be as sharp. But how can the I be dependent on what I eat or what I say? And it just all of this. And then it felt like it was also there was a consistent I, like I'm leaving school, technically an adult, and I feel the same as when I was my first day when I was 4. So what's that? But that's not the I that changes. And then it just hit me one day that there was no solid sense of self there, that they were just thoughts arising out of something. And that wasn't like a blissful realization for me. That was horrendous, right? That because the one thing I thought I had to stand on just collapsed. And I
Right.
didn't know anything about spirituality, not really.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's interesting that in the same way people who have near-death experience, the positive and the negative ones are often the same experience. So some people go, I was floating out of my
Right.
body and there was this tunnel I could see my relatives, or I was floating out of my body and my dead relatives. It depends on how you take it. And
Exactly.
I think I've heard you say similar things to that about depersonalization, haven't I?
Yeah. It's a tough one because what I feel really strongly about with um, derealizing spiritual paths or teachings or philosophies is that they blur the line between mystic and psychotic,
Mm.
which is that amazing quote. And I don't know who said it, but something like the mystic, no, the psychotic drowns in the same waters that the mystic
Yeah, I think
swims
it was
through.
Carl
But like,
Jung.
Oh, was it?
I
There's
think
so
so,
many
yeah.
quotes from Carl Jung that I didn't know were Carl Jung, and so it's interesting. But that, and it's just something that I'm still very interested in. How do we account for when depersonalization is freeing and liberating versus when it's harrowing and maddening? Because essentially they are based on the same thing. There's no me, there's no self. But in one moment, that can be the most exquisite, hilarious, transcendent freeing experience, and then even an hour later or a year later it flips into the opposite. So that's where I get back to this whole dangerous thing where you're describing something that's going to free you, where the description of it is sort of like textbook. If you go to the DSM, which I'm not a huge fan of, but you know what I mean,
I do know
something
what
that
you mean, yeah.
describes something that's horrifying for many people. So it's tricky.
Just because it became for me probably the most wonderful thing in life, that there is this great mystery in my center and I can touch that and marvel at it and be absorbed into it. But when it first hit
Sure.
me, I didn't have that context of knowing that was a good thing. I thought, oh, maybe I've just broken my brain here. It's going to be really bad. Mm. So how have
Sure.
you found this journey you've been on, coming out and talking about this and going on some like podcasts like Bat Gap, and a lot of people see this message now. I know you've received a fair chunk of correspondence with people, haven't you, saying non-duality ruined my life, essentially. And I'm going to assume you've also received some pushback of people saying, oh, well, Jessica just doesn't really get it. She's just not finally had that realization. When she does, she'll see it all makes sense. So
Yeah.
what's
Yeah.
been your
Yeah.
experience of like coming out and talking about this?
Yeah. Well, it's really good that you say that. The first thing that you said was, so I always want to, once the word non-duality comes up, I always get that, because when people have said, non-duality ruined my life, it's problematic, but the terminology is hard because again, non-duality is so many things. And what frustrates me about sort of the neo-Advaita and like modern Western non-dual stuff is that they're taking the word non-duality and making it seem like they have that they're what non-duality is, when non-duality, whether you think of it as non-division or oneness or whatever, is something that's, it's just something that's part of the universe. And of course, there's so many different mystical traditions that have non-duality within them. So I think one of the things that people push back on a lot is where they're like, it's not, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater of non-duality, but then what are you even talking about there? So I think it can be very important to say, what are the things that were ruining people's lives? And that would be more specifically, let's say, this idea and experience of you don't exist, the world isn't real, the one who's suffering is just this fictional story in your head, nothing matters, there's no doer, right? All of that stuff. And I've been getting, I can't tell you how many emails I've been getting from people who are just like, the story is always so similar. It's different, different situations, but it's always so similar. And I've been putting together and growing this archive of testimonials because it's just the most notable thing about it that's just so, I think, ironic but tragic is how this movement or teachings or experience, whatever you want to call it, is all dedicated to eradicating the sense of separateness and separation that's seen as the source of all suffering. And what the number one thing that most people say is that eventually, at some point, it left them more radically isolated, alone, and separated from other humans and from the world than they ever could have imagined. So I think that's a good kind of place to start in terms of what I hear from the most, is that kind of radical loss of relationality, detachment, and yeah, just total kind of isolation, which is, yeah.
It does intrigue me that when I've encountered people who are seriously into neo-Advaita, they're often not very relational people. They just make
No.
statements. They don't really converse. And that's the same thing you would expect to find with someone who was really so locked into their own sense of self, their own ego, that they can only contemplate their own thoughts and they can't recognize there's two people in this interaction. And
Yeah.
that's what comes across. And I can I've been trying to do it a bit this week in preparations of sinking back into my biography experientially, if you like, and thinking, okay, what was it like 6 months after I got into meditation, or a year, when I started to have those depersonalization experiences, and maybe started to
Yeah.
actually experience something of that greater consciousness, but to do it in a way where I was still very much there, kind of maybe conflating myself with it. It can be hard to language, but and having this sense of
Yeah.
not being relationed at all. Like someone would say something to me and I just wouldn't know how to respond because I'm just having this
Yeah.
experience of blankness, not some loving, vibrant consciousness manifesting through
That's
this physical
right.
form, just a blankness
Right.
then, of feeling like I don't know what to say. I'm actually far worse off for this. And even people who are really, I see people will write things about their like romantic relationships, maybe that, my partner finds it hard because there's no one here at the other end. There's no one to relate to. And on a experiential level now, I just don't get that. And it's not that I walked away from non-duality. I feel it was a long and circuitous journey, but I really benefited from it and feel much, much better
Mm-hmm.
from that sense of dissolution into this deeper presence, this deeper being that comes through me. But at
Yeah.
the same time, I feel like I know less have an individuated self or a personality than I have a body, if you see what I mean. It would be like a kind of crazy thing to deny that
Mm-hmm.
there's obviously a person here who's having this conversation with another person. So unless I try and sink back into how it was for me 20 years ago, I find it almost hard to relate to this stuff when I hear people. It doesn't sound healthy or desirable at all.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. And that's where I feel like it's something that does have that double-edged sword aspect, and where it can also have a bit of an expiration date, right? Because it's like, for me, it only came up when I realized how harmed my ability to be in relationships was, that I was like, fuck, like I have a choice to make here, right? It's like this impersonal, but oddly a very personal, impersonal bubble, right? Because that's the thing, is that it's who's it serving. It's a very personal, you know, self-centered, selfless path. As you can see, it makes you much more sort of radically self-reliant, which is what a lot of the teachings are ironically on, right? Is you don't need anything outside of yourself. You should be able to source, you know, all of your needs from within. And so it's just, yeah, that strange sort of irony of how that stuff happens. And then one of the things that I've gotten a lot of emails about is people saying how, like, you know, I almost wish that I didn't go down this path because I feel like I don't need my husband anymore. Like, there's a real something that was the most, I think, profound, not profound, but one of the most beneficial things on one hand was that I really felt like I didn't need anyone anymore. Like, it felt like all the reasons why you would seek a relationship, I no longer was seeking that, you know, whether it's validation or something, but it just didn't feel, it didn't feel important in that way anymore. And there's also a guy who this one's really sad. And he said that he was on an enlightenment path that really kind of was non-relational. And he became very detached from his wife, who he loved very much. And she passed away a couple of years ago. And it really hit him how much he had lost out on, you know, the preciousness of connecting, of course, with her in that deep human to human, there's a me here and a you there, you know, kind of way. So yeah, I'm kind of all over the place right now.
No, I mean, it brings up memories in me, Jessica, because I remember it informed my view of relationships, just any kind of friendship relationship, in that I should be radically self-reliant. So if somebody does something, like if you turn up for this conversation an hour late and drunk, I would just, that's absolutely fine, and I would never express frustration. And I remember after a few years, like getting wound up with a friend of mine and expressing that. I've talked to her about this since, actually, like what was going on there, because it was like I was kind of like a toddler again, like 2-year-olds, like they learn the word no and they go around saying it all the time, or they'll say something like really rude to their parents because like they want to have that experience with someone it's safe to have it with because they're finding
Right.
their own boundaries. I was like refinding that after almost immersing myself back in this womb, or really in just a strange ideology, because it's obviously it's not good for you or another person if you don't ever correct their behavior or point out how it's affecting you. And I definitely think it took me down that path, and I had to relearn those kind of boundaries then.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I think that's the really the relationality aspect of it is what's really hit me. And you know, this teaching and this path does not benefit relationships. in my perspective, in any real long-term, overall way for individually and also collectively. And I think when for me, like looking at the bigger picture of what is society suffering from the most? Of course, it's division, and that's what it's saying, except its antidote to that just creates more division, because what I've realized in trying to eradicate separation, you eradicate relationship. So it's the wrong thing to try to do. And so instead, my understanding has been, it's not about getting rid of separation. It's about adding in that there's also oneness, so that you have unity, rather than this idea that oneness is about disappearing. Because if you disappear, you've dropped out of relationship. And so I see so much the tragedy, which I really do think that this has become somewhat of like someone said cultural, and I said maybe more of a subcultural kind of tragedy or even crisis, because this generation is suffering so much from division and isolation, and it's creating more of that. And then also healthy relationships. Like, we've been learning so much about trauma and relational wounding, and how so much of our suffering comes from that early relational wounding. And these, we need to learn how to better communicate, how to have even sometimes more stable boundaries, and all of these things that eroding all of that just makes it so much worse, and so it's really hard to see people still going to these teachings that I just keep thinking, this is not going to help the things that society is suffering from the most. And those are only just a couple of examples.
Yeah, and for me, I think that one of the biggest things I got out of it, I mean, I suppose connecting with one's own deep conscious being requires no further justification, but it does have benefits, right?
Sure.
And I was able to find a place inside myself that was beyond my opinions, okay, like the ground in which opinions rise and fall. And then I'm not so attached to my opinions, and it opens up this way of dialoguing that's not warfare, because you're not fighting to defend an opinion which you seem like you're holding on to for dear life. So that was like an exploration for me of how can people embrace this consciousness in a way that overcomes the divisions which seem to get worse in society, politically, and all the rest. But I mean, I do see non-duality people who are really embracing that, but I also see this kind of real stuckness in I'm the only person here, and just a conflation then, because I wonder what you think about this. When people have this sense that they've really permanently dissolved into this consciousness and there's no personality left, I think they're not being honest with themselves quite a lot of the time. Because I think if anyone can like say anything on a YouTube video or get up on stage and give a presentation, like Tim made a point to me once that non-duality has a really low bar to entry, because all you've got to do is get up on a stage and say you don't exist and nothing's happening and this isn't real for 20 minutes, and you're a teacher. You don't have to like paint a nice painting or anything, and so like you can actually have some demonstration. And yeah, like the one I painted for this interview. Yeah. So there's no, and in a sense that makes it like I started a group a few years ago to do non-dual stuff, and one of the things I said at the start is like part of the reason I've done this, I started a group of other people, is I don't want to do competitive non-duality, right? Because it's like you get a group of people together and they're all kind of precious about like their inner state of consciousness they've attained, and there's no way of demonstrating that. So people start making assumptions about what someone else's consciousness is like. This person's awake, that person, I can see that this person's got it. No, they don't. And also what I see is those qualities, those more or less admirable human qualities like anger and lust, they don't go away. But when they occur in someone who thinks that they've stepped away from the personality, then they either have to be repressed or they have to be justified in some way. So like being annoyed with someone because they've insulted you becomes righteous anger. And you find like then there's an abusive guru, right? So just because of the levels of abuse you've seen in guru culture, the consistency of that, I think there has to be something in this process. Like it can't just be that narcissists always rise to the top. There has to be something in this process which is fundamentally unhealthy in what it does to your brain and the way you then relate or don't relate to people.
Yeah. I mean, I think the whole thing is spiritual bypassing. I mean, I think it's, at this point, I would say neo-Advaita, and of course, radical non-dualism is, I mean, that's what it is. It's spiritual bypassing. I mean, they pretty much denigrate any sense of doing any developmental work or psychotherapy or any of that. But there's that, I think, like you said, I think it's an illusion that that all of these complexes and all of these negative aspects of your personality are somehow cleared and healed and disappear because you've, you know, dissolved into the background awareness. And I think that it feels that way, and they can temporarily. But I think that's the big sort of blind spot there, is that it's all still there, and it's going to get triggered when you're back into those same situations, right? When something triggers your anger or you're in a relationship. But I think the thing to look at is the fact that it's very renunciate. It's, you know, a lot of times it's becoming radically self-reliant. You don't need relationships, and it's very detaching from, you know, from interactions a lot. So I think that you tend to avoid the situations that would trigger you, so you don't see that those things are still there. And then suddenly, I think for me at least, it was years later that I got what I call like shadow attacked, and was like, oh my God, all of that's still there. It just A, was repressed, and B, hadn't had a chance to be triggered because I was avoiding those situations anyway. So it's like, put that guru in a certain situation and you're going to see their buttons pushed, and you're going to see them, you know, unleash their rage, or, you know, be very, I think I've always said, like, a lot of these gurus are, I say they're like no self-righteous, because so many people know, they're like, why are these egoless neo-Advaitists so self-righteous and so snide and so smirky and condescending, right? Like, okay, you have no personality and no ego, but yet you constantly act as if you know better and that you're better than other people. And so there's obviously a lot of self-delusion going on. But it is very confusing. It's really confusing to think, when people say that, it's like, what is going on when people are saying that they've, you know, lost their entire sense of self, and they're no longer, you know, engaging in concepts, when clearly they are, because they're talking about the concept that they're not engaging in concepts, you know. So again, it is a question of like, how much of it is, I don't know if we need to say delusion, that's a bit extreme, though it can be, but illusory, right?
Yeah, and seductive thing to buy into. How have you found people emerging out of this? Because I mean, one of the issues is it's, oh, what's the word? Like a logically complete or something. Like it's a loop, right? There's a term, I can't think of it. Um, there's a kind of logical consistency to non-duality where it has an answer for everything. So if you're in it and you feel like you're not doing well, it's not having a good effect on you, it can be hard to reason your way out of it, because yeah, it is true that everything is just arising in consciousness, or something like that. You know, so how do you find people, your own maybe, and people's emergence out of this philosophy into a more healthy place?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really hard, because I think, you know, what me and, I don't know if you listened to the talk with Guy
I did,
Smith,
yeah.
it's really hard because it really has gotten a hold of your entire, you know, worldview, and in ways that you didn't realize, you know, like it's you think that it's beyond concepts, but it's not. It's just replaced. And I see it in some ways, it's mental reprogramming, because you've been radically deconditioned, right, to let go of everything, but then you've been reconditioned with all of these new beliefs about there's no self, there's no, you know, reality is just a dream, and all of this stuff is, on one hand, you can experience that, but these are beliefs that come along with it. So one thing is that you had mentioned this earlier, that a lot of people, not a lot of people, a few people have said, you know, oh, she's just, and these people were just clinging to concepts, right? So of course, if you just cling to the concepts, it could be harmful. But I think because of the fact that I did go so deeply into the actual experiences, that's why I can talk about how deeply depersonalizing things became and all of this stuff. So I think, of course, people can be harmed by just the belief system. But there's this real blind spot that somehow, if you let go of the beliefs and just sink into the experience, that there's never going to be any harm in that. And again, I'm sort of going off on tangents here. But I think in terms of emerging from it, a lot of it does have to do with deconstructing a lot of the truth notions. And I think the biggest one is ultimate truth, is this whole thing that we bought into this set of beliefs being the absolute, the ultimate truth, and it seemed to be corroborated in our experience. But you really have to break that down and say, was this belief that I was given first, let's say even self-inquiry, there is no self there, and this is how you're going to discover what I've already discovered and what all these other people have already predetermined as the ultimate truth. So then you do the questioning and you say, oh, I can't find my sense of self, so I don't exist, it was never real, I never existed. But if you hadn't been given those predetermined ways of interpreting that first, that might not be the experience you would have had. Maybe you would have gone inside and determined you were a unicorn, or just that, the self is not as solid as it seems to be. Doesn't have to be that it never existed and that, selfhood and the ego is a radical delusion. Like, that's a specific interpretation. So I think one thing is for people coming out and starting to realize that these are interpretations of truth, that are one set of them, but there are so many other sets of teachings that call themselves the ultimate truths. And I think breaking down the notion of ultimate truth has been big for a lot of people, because it feels like, for me, it was like, how could I ever come back to believing that myself has any validity again? I've seen so clearly that the self is just an illusion and that, the world is really just transparent. How could I possibly get out of that? So I think it is really important that people are able to then engage with it as sets of interpretations on experience that can then be offered new potential interpretations to check out in your experience. How does that sit with you? How does it sit with you in your experience that it's not that there's no separation, it's that everything is separate and one at the same time? Oh, okay, that also is feeling real right now, and for a lot of people feeling actually better. So yeah, there's that, I think.
Yeah, I'm having all these memories when I'm talking to you. So I started using the term deep state. I actually borrowed it from geopolitics before it became sort of well known and associated with Donald Trump. I did not see that coming. But I started using it maybe like 10, 12 years ago in reference to spirituality, to get away from this very defined map. Like, you go in, you discover your one consciousness, and that's it then. And I thought, do we lose some of the texture and the richness of experience, going in and experiencing all these different levels of consciousness and what consciousness is, and the paradoxes of seeing the thing that is looking? Do we lose some of that when we tell this simplistic narrative about it? And maybe if I get rid of that and just, okay, we go inside, and what we can say is there's something really deep there. Like, you don't just go to this superficial sense of self and that's it. There's something really deep and rich and inviting. And at the time, it was preferable to me, because it leaves open a sense of mystery. It leaves open a sense that whatever I'm experiencing, my interpretation of that could be completely wrong. Okay, and it's interesting for me now, because I've not really been involved I was never massively involved in spiritual groups other than Tim Freaks, but I haven't been to one of those in 5 years, and I don't think about spirituality on a day-to-day basis, or the language of it, or anything like that. So, but I have the experience, but all the kind of concepts have fallen away. So I don't just have these advaita thoughts running around in my head anymore. And it's interesting to sort of live without that. But I recall at the time where, like, I had this, I was about 24, I had this big mystical experience of the veil of the world falling away and myself collapsing, and this infinite ocean of love opening up. But it did strike me, well, I'm really into Advaita, and I had a very Advaita experience. Now, I wonder if I'd been a Christian, would I have had the same kind of emotional experience but met Jesus or something, I wonder to what extent, like, it just seemed too much of a coincidence, right? That, the Advaita map is true, then, is it right? So I always like to maintain some sense of intellectual curiosity that the map could be wrong. And of course, Tim's gone into that in a big way, at deconstructing maps and so.
Right. And at this point for me, I'm just kind of done with these notions of ultimate truth. And to be honest, I don't care if this mystical map is the ultimate truth. I'm concerned with how it affects my life. I'm concerned with how it affects my relationships and how it affects other people and society. And so I think the thing with trying on or exploring different maps is to see what experience it leads to.
Mm.
And what values does it lead to? Because one of the things I've thought about a lot lately is like, what does that map and the experience that results from it, what kinds of values and qualities does it give rise to? You know, does it give rise to a sense of there being significance to one's life? Does it give rise to meaninglessness, optimism, nihilism, altruism, disdain for humanity? You know, that's what feels more important to me lately, is to think about, you know, I don't need to just critique the truths or the truth paradigm of, you know, Eastern non-duality or neo-Advaita or whatever it is. I can talk more on what's the impact that it has on people's lives.
Mm.
I think we've had, I don't know, 20, 30, maybe more years in the West to see what these modern non-dual teachings are and aren't doing. And I think that we're possibly not looking enough collectively at that to see, are they actually producing the results they claim to be, right? That
Mm.
there's no more separation and people are free and people are, you know, experiencing, you know, radical effortlessness and bliss all the time. But what's that actually leading to? Is it leading to a greater sense of solidarity with the human condition? Is it creating a sense of people wanting to be more engaged in the direction that society goes in? Is it leading to people valuing each other more, to collaboration, you know, to all of these different qualities and values that make a difference? And so, yeah, I guess I'm just saying that I've been shifting a lot also from just talking about the map itself to what is that map leading to in
Mm.
terms of, again,
Yeah,
the
well, just on, I think it's reality is there's something almost too much of it to be contained. It's too big to be contained by a single map,
yes.
even if one of those maps is true. So, I've,
Yeah.
more recently, I've read some books on evolutionary psychology, right? And it's really interesting to get a completely different explanation for behaviors that I would have seen through a
Yeah.
spiritual lens, saying,
Right.
oh, maybe that's why I do that. I have thought of that, you know. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying that is the
Exactly.
ultimate truth either, but it's just it is interesting how I quite favor pluralism. Okay, there's no any to be stuck on
Right.
any one map is very constraining.
Exactly. And that's kind of what I feel we've wanted to move away from with, you know, the fundamentalism of a lot of theistic religions. It's like the Bible is the source
Mm.
of, you know, that higher authority. And I think this, you know, I always don't know, do I say neo-Advaita, do I say radical non-dualism? But again, I guess I'll say like a lot of the modern popular non-dual teachings in the West, I've kind of replicated that very same model. I had a woman who wrote to me the other day and she's like, it ended up being the same experience as my fundamental Christianity. You know, we couldn't question the guru or, you know, the non-guru spiritual guide. You know, that was off limits because this person had the ultimate truth. He was the authority. There was no room for questioning that. You know, it was really not so different. It's, you know, that authoritarian sort of dynamic that's built into any model that has ultimate truth in one person or some people that have it and others that don't.
Yeah, and after being involved for 3 or 4 years, I realized how willing I'd been to buy into a really authoritarian model, and that shocked me because I don't think I was like that before. I would have certainly classed myself as quite anti-authoritarian. If you'd asked me, I probably would have said I was when I'm going through that. Was
Yeah.
buying into a very authoritarian hierarchical system. And when I saw what I'd done, I was quite shocked by it.
Yeah. There's that moment of like, me how is that me that got that happened to? But yeah, I think that's a big like stunning moment for a lot of people when they start to see that. And I think with this maps conversation, that it's like in plurality, it's nice to be able for people to have more options, because I think that a lot of people, again, they think that unity consciousness and they think that oneness is for me, I feel like the oneness of my early non-dual days wasn't oneness in terms of being one with others or being one with the universe. It was actually just disappearing, right?
Mm.
It was like becoming everything else besides this. And there was no withness because there was no more relationship. So I think you have this model of like oneness is something that you get to by disappearing versus other models of oneness, which are that both and of only because there's separateness and there's individuation can we experience oneness with others. And this kind of comes to Tim's, well, I mean, it's a lot of people's, but Tim's, is one example of that, where you've got separation and oneness, and you've got that both and that allows for there to be a oneness with, right? Like you and I are separate, but we're also one, and so we're able to commune and communicate as one thing arising as two things. And for me, that's unity. But yeah, so I think something that's helping people as well is to see that, that's not oneness, that's an experience that people are referring to as oneness. But there's also other experiences that people refer to as oneness, and getting to try those and see, again, to have a choice, because again, when I got rid of this whole notion of like needing to find the truth, it was like, I want to choose what's going to be true for me, again, based on how I want to experience life. And so,
Yeah. I'm just remembering actually an experience which really hit me. Coming to when my doubts about this were growing. Okay, I was in a group that was doing non-dual stuff, right? It wasn't Tim's group, but well, let's say a lot of people in it were very invested in Eastern spirituality in different ways, and they
yeah,
would make jokes about Christianity as being like this really basic kind of intellectual dogmatic religion, but they weren't the most compelling people in terms of just how they conducted themselves with others and their basic sense of manners. And then on the last, I was basically on a trip with them, and on the last day, one of the guys in the trip, who they hadn't always been particularly pleasant to, revealed to me that he was a Christian. We were having dinner, and he said, "Yeah, I just kept quiet about it because I can see it's going to elicit a lot of comments, and I don't really understand what they're talking about with all this non-dual stuff, to be honest. So, or how does it relate to Christianity?" And I said, "Well, you've been a perfect gentleman like the entire time we were there, right? But I'm probably guilty of this myself, that I would see Christianity as being like less than, because I went to Sunday school and all the rest, right? And I felt a bit, maybe, I
yeah,
don't know, let down by the Christian faith, that it gave me nothing in terms of answers to deeper philosophical questions of self or the universe or anything. So I feel like I'm inside the club enough to critique it, right? And let's say where it sort
yeah,
of failed me. But I'm listening to this guy and I'm thinking like, well, they've got all the correct opinions, right? They know all the right words to use and
mm-hmm.
everything, and yet that is not translated into being like half decent human beings in the way this guy's Christianity obviously has. So that really made me think again about ideology and become very cynical about people using the right words, right? And it doesn't really matter, does it, if you're worshiping Jesus or whatever? The model is irrelevant, and I had like a lot less patience for people just engaging in non-dual speak after that, as if that meant something.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's, the whole thing of looking down on, there was a lot of talk of like, this is a corrective experience to religion, right? And all of those things. But there were so many ways, of course, I didn't see till later, that it was really just perpetuating a lot of those same pitfalls that seemed to be something really new. Obviously it had new elements to it, but it hadn't really broken out of that framework again of, right, like that hierarchy and that authoritarian, that ultimate truth. Not to mention lots of other things like notions of salvation and purity and renunciation. A lot of stuff now that I've come to see is like, oh wow, it's actually a lot more carryover here than I realized.
And what does spirituality look like for you now that you've, what does it look like for you now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think about this a lot because spirituality is such a difficult word, of course, to describe. But for me, there's been just this really big sort of like heart opening component to my experience, that whether you call it spiritual or mystical or whatever it is, it's about relationship, to be honest. Just feeling that being a part of a greater whole that I think all of us, or I feel that all of us are expressions of. And so it's more about, like I said, that oneness of, this phrase I really like that Jason Schulman says, a oneness of multiplicity. And it's just been radically different because the biggest thing that's changed, and I think I had mentioned this to you wanting to talk about, was that shift from experiencing life as, let's say, somewhere on a spectrum of real or not real, or more of a dream or not a dream, to everything now being non-dual. But I don't like the word non-dual anymore because of its issues. I like this term now, unidual, that I did get from Tim, but I think it really encapsulates that both, and it's that co-arising of oneness and separateness, that of course gives rise to relationship, but that everything has become real again and doesn't lose any of the mystery. It's become more mysterious, and it's been this new appreciation of just the awe for the mundane. It's not mundane anymore, and that all of these things that I had been taught to look beyond or beneath, or to dissolve into, that is this, it's that everything is a real expression of that. And there's so many words you could say for that, right? It's like the ground of being, or pure awareness, or pure consciousness, or I don't feel it's pure consciousness anymore, but a lot more of this. I was describing this the other day, and it felt really close to how I experience it, is that it used to be that everything is really the ground of being, right? So you could reduce everything that's a form, and that's really its essence, is that baseline. And now it's more so that the ground of being, or being itself, is blooming into all of this. So there's that being becoming, but it's really that this is the ground of being, but it's the ground of being emerged into all of this. So no longer is anything blocking that, because it is that. It's just that formlessness now informed. And this is a radical change for me, of course, because it removes all of the derealization. It removes all of the need to, detach from anything. And it gives back, so much of what I had lost through spirituality, but even kind of gave me reality back like tenfold. Sort of that, oh my God, it's not this, everything's actually formlessness. It's, oh fuck, that formlessness is actually all of this. It's become all of this. And it's, for me, it's just now, that's what I most really want to share with people, I think.
So I had a thought, and I wonder if you ever consider, Jessica, that you've gone on a circuitous route, and do you consider you might have ended up being a kind of spiritual teacher?
That I might have ended up
being a kind of spiritual teacher, in the kind of things you're saying are very consistent with what people in Zen have said and all the rest. And I wonder if what I'm really getting at is there a way to escape that? Because on the one hand, you're doing a well-timed critique of non-duality, but do you really step outside of that, or do you become then a kind of spiritual teacher? You're saying, you were like the Zen master saying, just listen to that babbling brook, right? Forget all your attempts to find formlessness. Just look at the glory of the babbling brook. And I wonder if you've considered that you've ended up being there in a sense.
I don't think so. I don't think I experience it that way. I do resonate with what you're saying about, there's this one part of what I feel called to do, which is sort of the, I guess you could say critiquing or sort of unpacking the philosophies of different non-dualisms, if you will, and then revisioning other ones or exploring other ones. And I think what I do ultimately want to do is offer this experience, this unidual experience, that I think you can experience it doing the eye gazing with Tim, but really that experience of being, and he uses the term, which I really love, which is unividual, where there's that experience of being both separate but also one at the same time, and to experience how life changes and how relationship changes from that level of perception. But I don't think I see myself as a teacher or wanting to become a teacher per se. I think I do want to share these things, but it's more like I want to explore these things together with other people, like in community. I do want to create community, I think, where this stuff can be explored together, but definitely not in a hierarchical way. More of, let's say, like I've been part of some online platforms where everyone's encouraged to, let's say, give a guided meditation or to give a talk about something. Like, it's sort of more about everybody collaborating on something, which is also what I've experienced a lot with Tim. Like, it's hard for me to even call Tim a teacher,
Yeah.
right? Or
Yeah, it was a deliberately cheeky question in some way, because I just would be interested to see how you would respond to it. And Tim, in a sense, I probably put spiritual teacher on his tax return. I don't know, but he doesn't really assume that role. And I think quite rightly, he thinks that it's different to being a violin teacher or something like that, or a driving instructor. Like, you don't really teach spirituality that way. And in the time I spent with Tim, different people might feel differently about this, but I didn't observe people treating him like a teacher. Like, it's almost like he didn't attract people who wanted that kind of thing. And it was very much like a shared experience, and he was running the group. But there were some really interesting people in that group, like equally as interesting as Tim. So there was always a very shared energy in the group, and people just didn't seem to relate to Tim as someone you would take this course of lessons from, and by lesson 10 you'd be enlightened. It was more like a sharing of knowledge. So I very much value. I think it seems to me to be a far healthier approach. It might not be the right approach for everyone, I don't know, but it seems to me far healthier in this.
Yeah. I mean, it's also a question of right approach to what exactly, because what are you seeking? And I think a lot of people that come to Tim's or are refreshed by what Tim is doing or saying or offering are people that are disillusioned by that old model of, the guru or the teacher who claims that they're not really a teacher because they don't really exist, that kind of thing, that you eventually see through, where they're sort of the holder of the vision that everyone else is supposed to get to. Whereas with Tim, and I just felt it the other day, it's like, I feel like in the group that ICU that he has that meets every Sunday, it's like we're all part of kind of co-creating this new experiential paradigm it's based on a philosophy. But part of why he loves, I think, having this group is because it challenges him, and he wants people to challenge him and doubt him. He teaches often the importance of doubt. And so it's just those elements of guruism or that sort of that hierarchy thing are just not there. So it feels more like he's a friend. He's somebody who's offering us something to try on and give our feedback on it, and ask questions. It's just very egalitarian. It's awesome.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about or bring up?
Let me see if there was. I did take a few notes. Gosh, I mean, there's just so many things, so I'm not sure. How about you?
I sort of feel kind of good at this point, and we can always do something else in the future.
Sure.
I just feel, as in terms of the flow of the interview or conversation, I think it's probably that's gone well, and it's just what we've done probably fits into one package.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I feel like if I open up something else, it's like I'm like, let's talk about, is consciousness primary or not? Let's don't think that's a good time to start that.
I mean, I'd love to do that, but I think they really would fit on another occasion. Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. No, I feel really good. You asked some questions that really that sparked some good reflection for me.
Great. But so before we sort of conclude the recording part, do you want to mention your website? And I don't know if you're running any groups or anything at the moment or doing anything like that. I know you've trained as a group facilitator, right? But anything you want to mention before we cut the recording?
Yeah, sure. Well, the website is thegloriousbothand.com. And what I am coordinating right now is sort of casual support meetup group, because I've been meeting one-on-one with a lot of people that are coming out of sort of the haze of the derealizing non-dual neo-Advaita stuff, and just connecting with each other and realizing that we're all in very similar places, trying to kind of return to our sort of verve and sense of motivation and engagement. And so we are it's about 8 of us so far. But I encourage people to email me, like to write through the website, share your story, ask questions, but also let me know if you would want to meet other people, connect with other people that are navigating this kind of transition to a new and kind of a return to reality in a new way, if you will.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jessica.
Sure. Thank you.